Good afternoon. I'm Michael Cheney, Executive Director of the Francis Perkins Center, and we're delighted to bring you the 13th Annual Garden Party. Virtually this year, but we are speaking to you from the homestead, adjacent to the garden where previous garden parties have occurred. We're delighted to bring you this afternoon's program that includes award recipients Juana Rodriguez-Vazquez, receiving the Open Door Award for her work in Millbridge, Maine, working with immigrant and migrant communities for the last 20 years and developing education programs for the families that work there. In addition, we welcome Heather Cox Richardson, the historian from Boston College, who writes prolifically about the current American political scene as in the context of American history. And also, Senator Elizabeth Warren will make some remarks regarding Francis Perkins and her work today in the advocacy for consumer rights and for a better possible life for all. We're excited to speak about the future of the Francis Perkins Homestead National Historic Landmark and our plans for the future and the construction of a national education center here to serve students, policymakers, and the general public in the future. We're speaking to you today from the Francis Perkins Homestead National Historic Landmark, and we will be talking more about our future plans later in the program. It's my pleasure to introduce the chair of the board, Sarah Peskin.
I'd like to thank Governor Mills and Senator Chloe Maxman for their advocacy and assistance in obtaining a very significant appropriation, allowing the Francis Perkins Center to open the homestead to make it safe and accessible. And we are extremely grateful for the $100,000 that they have offered to the center through the Maine State Historic Preservation Commission. We're especially grateful for this gift from the state of Maine because it provides an important match to the Francis Perkins Center for the $500,000 grant that we've recently received from the National Park Service Save America's Treasures program. And that, in addition to the many donations and pledges we've received, small and large, from many individuals and organizations, is making our preservation effort possible here at the homestead. We're happy to report that we're well on our way with $3.2 million raised towards our $5.5 million capital campaign for the homestead preservation and restoration effort. And we want you to watch your announcements for our opening next spring when the site will be open for public visitation and we can welcome you here. We'd like to give our special thanks and appreciation to our major corporate sponsors of today's garden party, the First National Bank and Spencer Preservation Group, in addition to the many sponsors who will be listed by name at the end of the program.
It is a real pleasure to introduce Juana Rodriguez-Vazquez. We traveled to Millbridge, Maine, and spent a morning with her at her workplace, mano a mano, and I am just bowled over by what she has accomplished in the last 2 decades, working with immigrant and migrant workers up in Washington County, Maine, and Aroostook County, and in the fishery in Maine, providing a place, a setting for education, for community building and bonding. This woman works her life for the benefit of others in her community and has built a very strong community in Millbridge. Juana came to Maine over 20 years ago as a worker and then was hired in 2016 by Mano and Mano to begin the work of supporting families working here in the agriculture and fishery industries. She has increased her own capacity by achieving a BA at the University of Maine and is certified as a K-8 teacher. She lives her life through her own experience, making lives better for others in her community. We are pleased to present Juana with the Francis Perkins Center's Open Door Award. Thank you for welcoming us to Millbridge and Mano and Mano. I'd like to start by asking how your family came to live in the United States, and specifically to live in Millbridge, Maine. And how do you describe Millbridge to those friends of yours that live in other parts of the world?
My family first came to live in the United States. My father moved here as a migrant worker to Florida to pick apples. And then a year after, he went back, and we migrated when I was 4.5 years old, almost 5, to Florida. We started there, and we migrated back from Florida to Michigan every year, doing different kind of field work, from apples, oranges, watermelon, and different kinds. And then after one of my father's friends invited him to come to Millbridge to work at the sea cucumber factory. So originally he was coming down just for the season of the sea cucumber. We left our trailer back in Florida. We got here for the sea cucumber factory, and then he kind of then it was blueberry season after that, so we stayed for the blueberry season and ended up staying here after that.
So tell us a bit about your journey over the last 20 years that led you to lead Mano and Mano.
It's been quite a bit of a journey since I was 5 years old. I mentioned we started out in the fields back and forth every year. I never really finished school in either Florida or Michigan because the seasons would end and start at different times. So I would start school in one school and end it in another. Since then, when we arrived to Millbridge, this was the first school in Millbridge that I attended full years, and then was able to graduate from Rodriguez-Vazquez High School. After that, I went to school for a year. I got my cosmetology license, and I did some work in cosmetology. But I always wanted to do education. That was really what I always wanted to do. So when my son turned 5, I went back to school. I went to the University of Machias, pursuing a degree in education. I started working with Mano when I was still in school, with the migrant education program. I started as a coordinator, and then I moved into the migrant education program director. And then recently, I now became the interim executive director for the organization. And as well started a bilingual childcare program with the organization as well in January.
Now, the Blueberry Harvest School has been going for some years, correct?
Yes.
And that gives workers, children, a way to continue learning while they're here. Is that?
Yes, so the Blueberry Harvest School runs for during the blueberry harvest season, which is usually in the month of August. It runs for 3 to 4 weeks, and it provides educational support for families here while they're here. Usually a lot of the migrant children miss school because of their migratory life. They're traveling, so usually when they're here, sometimes, like I mentioned, their schools back home have already started, so they're missing school. So it provides educational summer services for them in a way that's more social, emotional, cultural, language way. So it's a different kind of like public education. So we try to involve a lot of the culture of the children in our programming, and that runs usually the beginning of August to the end of August.
So Francis Perkins is the person that we celebrate at our organization, and she said that the people are what matter to government, and a government should aim to give all people under its jurisdiction the best possible life. That seems to be quite a match for Mano and Mano.
Yes, we are. With the programs that we do, we try to help community members to be able to live a better life here with all of our different programmings. One of the recent with our childcare program, We're supporting families to be able to have affordable childcare, bilingual childcare for their kids, to be able to work, to have a place where they can leave their kids, younger kids, and feel comfortable leaving them and being out and work and finding work and life to be able to be a better life. So with all the programs that we have with our migrant education program, we're supporting migrant and students and families to be able to advocate for them to get services, educational or basic needs services that they need while they're in the area, but also to empower them to take that advocacy and those examples wherever they travel as well, so that they take them with them as well. Language is a big challenge. All of the organizations and places here, like, it's a barrier to access health, education, anything here, bankings, like language has been a big barrier for a lot of the people coming in, especially for a small town. Even though, like I mentioned, we've been here for over 20 years, it seems like it's not catching up yet. And language still seems to be a barrier here. Another barrier is there's a lot of discrimination that happens when, like, during August we have over 400 people of color that come into the area, and all of a sudden the grocery store is filled. It's been happening for years, but still it's a small town, and it's something that, like, all of a sudden people see. So there's those challenges that come with that as well. I think one of the other challenges here is the acceptance of culture. Down East Maine, like you probably know, has a culture of itself. So coming from a different culture and bringing that into the Down East culture is a challenge. As Mano, we try to celebrate culture with doing different events that bring together the community by sharing the culture. But it's definitely a challenge when you have a different culture bringing into a culture that has been here for years, and people who have their ways, and it's hard for them to be accepted and changing as well.
Well, Washington County is a different county than other counties in Maine, for sure. And it's remarkable how this organization has taken hold in Washington County, and I think the rest of the state could learn lessons from that.
To be able to do this and to be able to give to the community and give what I have and what my own experience and share, it feels good. I think I like the same way that people gave to me when I was in need, and when I was a migrant child and trying to figure out life, like, to me it's like I'm giving back. So to me it's like it feels good to be able to give back to other people and to support the community, support my family as well. I think that there's no other feeling of, like, it's satisfying. It feels good to be able to do that.
Well, the Frances Perkins Center voted to present you with its annual Open Door Award, and it is given because Frances Perkins' grandmother told her that when a door opens to you, you must go through it. And that's exactly what you've done with this organization as a staff person and now as interim executive director. And we're very proud to present you with that recognition.
Well, thank you. Yes. When the door opens to you, walk in and open it out to other people as well, and let them come in as well. And I'm grateful to be able to receive this award. Thank you.
I'm sure there are very few of you who don't recognize the name Heather Cox Richardson. We're absolutely thrilled that she's able to join us here today, and we welcome her for her wisdom, clarity, for making sense of the daily onslaught of news we need to understand but often find hard to face. You remind us how important good teachers are to a functioning democracy.
Heather Cox Richardson, welcome to the Frances Perkins Homestead National Historic Landmark.
It's such a pleasure to be here.
And we'd like to have a conversation about your role in interpreting a broad swath of United States history, and particularly political party politics and the world in which Frances Perkins operated. But I wanted to start with both your family and Frances Perkins' family have deep roots in Mid-Coast Maine. You have said that Frances Perkins was one of your mother's heroes, and her story is one of those that got me into doing history. Why was your mother so intrigued with Frances Perkins?
Well, I can't speak for my mother, who's been gone for many decades now, but what I remember about hearing about Frances Perkins when I was a young girl was that there was somebody famous who lived in Newcastle, and she had done something important. And the joke that Mother told at the time, or that I'd heard at the time, I'm sure you've heard a million times, that FDR was the meanest man in the world because he kept Frances Perkins in labor for 12 years. Which at the time was a totally racy joke, I think, when it was told. But I think that Frances Perkins meant a lot to a lot of women in that era because, of course, it's the World War II that really brings a lot of women into both the Army, where my mother served, but also into new industries and new ways of interacting with the world. And after that period, when so many women went back into their homes, they took with them the idea that there really were opportunities for women to reach out and change the world, as Frances Perkins had. So as I got older and I realized that she was the driving force behind so much of the New Deal, it strikes me that you really can't understand modern America, but certainly America since World War II, without understanding the role of Frances Perkins herself and also so many women like her that she inspired. And the fact that so few people really understand how important Frances Perkins is strikes me as being a huge problem. Because what she does is she translates, if you will, the 19th century world in which she grew up, the world around here that was a world of community and of people caring for each other and of everybody trying to make sure that everyone in the community could survive, into a modern world. She had watched the rise of urban America, and she'd participated, of course, in the settlement houses, and she'd seen the extraordinary tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And she recognized that something had to be done to soften those sharp edges of urban America. And she managed to do it within this new Democratic Party that then translated, in a sense, that idea of community and of taking care of each other from the small town of Newcastle, Maine, into the larger American political scene to affect all Americans. And it's really an extraordinary transformation, and one that I think would not have come from somebody who didn't have that community background and perhaps wasn't a woman.
How in the world did she produce the legislation that she did in the context of the Republican and Democratic parties?
Well, that's a deeper study than I know of how she actually managed to twist arms, but she did have some important things going for her. First of all, I suspect you know the story about how she felt that men would do what she wanted so long as she reminded them of their mothers. So she deliberately dressed in very conservative, old lady-ish ways and tried to hang back and convince them that they were doing what they wanted to do rather than what she wanted them to do. But in part, you have to wonder if that wasn't a performance for her. She's obviously whip smart, and she comes out of a world where women were changing, again, urban America by finding pressure points and making the men who ran cities, for example, do what needed to be done to preserve the lives of people in those cities. So her work in the settlement houses I suspect, is far more important than the fact she was dressing like people's mothers, that she recognized how you find power and how you put pressure on power, and she worked with the people who had power.
As an historian, why do you suppose that Frances Perkins was somewhat lost in history until recently?
So that's a complicated question, and I actually like, in a sense, that she was lost, and I'll explain why I say that in a minute. I think after World War II, America was very interested in portraying a certain version of America in our history books, and that didn't necessarily include a woman from Newcastle, Maine, who had to support her family and who had gone ahead and created a different kind of America than had existed in the 1920s, which so many people wanted to get back to. So she got read out of the story, and she got read out of the story, I think, most dramatically after about 1980, when our stories really did change, you know, when there was a backlash against the budding women's movement. And if you think about the way, for example, we looked at media, or the way we looked at Congress. In the 1970s, there was this sense that, you know, women really were stepping up. The daughters, if you will, of people like Frances Perkins were stepping up and taking on a role in American society. And that really shuts down in a big way in the 1980s and going forward, when the public world becomes much less centered around the idea of universal equality the way it had been immediately after World War II. So there's a lot lost in that period. But the reason that I say, in a way, I'm glad that that happened is because the New Deal, as it was constructed by people like Frances Perkins, because of the moment in which they were working, they had to get any legislation through the Southern Democrats, who tended to be much more conservative than the urban Northern Democrats, and they also had to get whatever they could through the Republicans in the West. That New Deal tended to center around the concept of a man supporting his family. Very traditional way of looking at the world. And Frances Perkins, of course, helped to construct that way because of the time in which she was doing it. But what's interesting to me about right now, we're talking in 2021, is we are in the process of once again reworking the concept of the American government and how it's going to interact with its citizens. And what we are starting to embody is, I suspect, much closer to the original vision of people like Frances Perkins and Florence Kelley and Jane Addams than what we got with the New Deal. Because what the settlement house workers were really doing was trying to rebuild a concept of community in an urban center, in an urban setting. And they came, of course, from rural settings themselves. And so the idea that we are now reclaiming the idea that the New Deal came in large part from Frances Perkins, and that Social Security came from Frances Perkins, and that there was at the heart of this a community ideal that was intended originally to reach far beyond simply putting men back in the position that they could support their families, but rather that they could create a community that included women and people of color and urban immigrants and children into a national community. I think Frances Perkins' moment has come, and in a way it's nice that we get to write her story anew.
So the Great Crash illustrated a failure of the American economic system, and it demonstrated what happens when there is no money and no work. Did that change any of this perception of what the government can and should do?
Well, see, this is why I think people like Frances Perkins are so important. And FDR, of course. I mean, we're focusing on her because we're in her house, but there's a lot of people who were a part of that particular moment. I actually love the 1920s. I almost said 1820s. I like them a lot too. I love the 1920s because to me it's the last period in American history where you can look at people arguing ideology honestly. So what I mean by that is, in the 1920s, with the landslide election of 1920, when Americans elected Warren G. Harding as president. He's from Ohio. He's from Marion, Ohio. He's a newspaper guy. And he himself recognizes that he's not equipped to be in the White House. But for the Republicans who put Harding in office, what the Republicans argue, is they've never been able to make America as great as it should have been since the Civil War, because they have never, except for a brief period under Benjamin Harrison, had complete control of the American government. And so now, finally, they've got it. They've got the White House, they've got the Supreme Court, they've got, which is not, part of the legislative process, but they know that the Supreme Court's going to be on their team. They've got Congress, the House and the Senate, and they're going to be able to do whatever they want. And they deliberately, and you actually have the Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, who is out in the newspapers saying we got to slash taxes, we got to stop regulation, we got to get rid of everything that the progressives did in the early 20th century, because what we really need to do is turn the government over to business, because businessmen understand what they're doing, which in many ways is an argument that echoes back to that argument I just mentioned with James Henry Hammond, the idea that individuals know their own needs best and that nobody knows the needs of the country better than those people who've been successful at business. They know what they're doing. So they're going to make this work. And it seems to work, right? The 1920s look great if you are reading magazines from the urban areas, if you are one of the upwardly mobile Americans at the time, if you're a woman looking at the flappers, if you are, and the music and the radios, and we get the rise of country music in this period, and the lionization of different ethnic and rural cultures, and America just seems like it's great. You got all these new products that are being sold with the new advertising that comes out of the Committee on Public Information and George Creel during World War I, and it just seems like it's this incredibly vibrant, exciting time. And the people who are looking at this, the Western farmers, for example, whose prices are plummeting because they expanded during World War I, and there's a glut in production, and now they're working on marginal land, and the prices are dropping, and they're going to Congress saying, do something. And Calvin Coolidge says, no, you just need to advertise more. Well, of course, they're stuck in an international system that is crushing them, and African Americans who are suffering under not only the terrible working conditions under which they're living, but lynching is on the rise as well, and immigrants who are being first abused by the KKK in the early 20s, and then we get the 1924 Immigration Act, which sets quotas for the first time in American history, and there's all these people who aren't participating, but they're not getting oxygen, and the newspapers and the Republican Party is saying, hey, look, we figured it out. We have figured it out so well that we don't really need reform organizations any longer, because everybody's getting rich, everybody's making money, which of course is not even vaguely true, but that's what it looks like. And we're not going to need to take care of poor people any longer, because there aren't going to be any poor people anymore. We've done it. We've done everything so well. Well, when that collapses, as it does in 1929, what happens is it pulls the rug out not only from the Republican Party, which has dominated the 1920s, but from the idea that their vision of America is in fact this greatly successful one, because suddenly people like John Dos Passos, the great writer who talked about how, they have clubbed us on the streets, all of a sudden people are saying, wait a minute, he was onto something. But what was going to replace it was not at all clear. And that's when you get stepping into that place people like Frances Perkins and FDR, of course, and the people who surrounded politicians like FDR, people who had been watching the growth of American society since the turn of the century and said, something's off. Come look at the cities. Come look at the fact that kids are not getting educations, that people are being maimed in workplace accidents, that we've got this phenomenal breakdown of America that is creating individuals who don't know how to be American citizens, who can't live lives, and we don't have to live this way. We need to figure out how to keep the extraordinary production of our industrial economy by also filing off its terrible human abuses.
I just had one last question, and it has to do with your current work with Letters from an American. And you've engaged a whole new audience, hundreds of thousands of people. What led you to do this and continue to do it?
That's actually a fun question and very appropriate sitting here. I didn't start them. They in a funny way, they started me. I was actually moving. And I had been painting the house I was moving out of. I was painting around the door, the windows, and I was stung by a yellow jacket. And I'm allergic to yellow jackets. And I, of course, did not have my EpiPen. And my brother-in-law probably still holds it against me to this day because he was with me. And he's like, we're in the middle of nowhere and you don't have your EpiPen. But so I sat down to see how badly I was going to react, and I had a professional Facebook page for a number of years where I wrote an essay about once a week, just on something I wanted to write about. And I hadn't written since July 18th, and people had asked me if I was okay. This was September 15th. And I thought, well, I got nothing else to do while I'm sitting here swelling. I might as well answer people and, tell them that, what's going on in the world. So I hadn't written in a number of months. So I said, let me just tell you where I think the world is right now. And then I hit send, and I was okay. I drove back to Boston to teach for a couple days, and I got swamped with questions. And I thought, well, I don't really want to, fill up the airwaves here, be one of those people who's always posting on Facebook. But then questions kept coming in, so I thought, well, okay, I'll go ahead. And I answered on September 17th their questions, and I've written every night since. And so it's been a really exciting time to be writing, and I feel very much like I'm a scribe for America. It's called Letters from an American because of Letters from an American Farmer, which was one of the early attempts to decide what it meant to be an American. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, who wrote in the early Republic. And also it's a nod to Alistair Cook's Letters from America, in which he tried to do a snapshot, only once a week, not once a night, but a snapshot of what America looked like in that moment. And so what I'm trying to do is do a snapshot of the country every day for people living today, but also for history, for that graduate student in 150 years who's sitting there going, wait a minute, who was Volodymyr Zelensky again? I want her to be able to sit back and say, wait a minute, I know Richardson's got this covered. She can tell me what happened on September 19th. And so it's sort of I sort of feel like it's a group project of trying to create a community again in this country to decide what we want to be and who we want to be. And it's an exciting time to be living it.
Well, as you know, hundreds of thousands depend upon you, and this is the reason why the Frances Perkins Center wanted to give you the recognition of our annual Intelligence and Courage Award, because it is courageous what you do every day, and we appreciate it.
Well, I am absolutely honored, and it's such a pleasure to be in her space and talking to you about a woman who has been part of my life ever since I can remember, actually.
Good. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
We are pleased to recognize Senator Elizabeth Warren with the Intelligence and Courage Award this year. In addition to her advocacy, lifelong advocacy for the American consumer, Senator Warren has also expressed a personal connection with Frances Perkins. She gave a speech in Washington Square on February 16, 2019, during the presidential campaign, behind a podium constructed of wood that came from the Frances Perkins homestead. And this is what Senator Warren said about Frances Perkins in Washington Square. Frances went on to become the first woman in American history to serve in the cabinet. And what did she push for when she got there? Big structural change. She worked the political system relentlessly from the inside, while others applied pressure from the outside. So what did one woman, one very persistent woman, do, backed up by millions of people across the country? Social Security, unemployment insurance, abolition of child labor, the minimum wage, the right to join a union, even the very existence of the weekend. Big structural change. Thank you, Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Hello, Frances Perkins Center. I wish I could be with you in person to celebrate the annual garden party, but that's just not possible right now. If we were together, I have no doubt we'd be taking selfies and we'd be sharing our deep and abiding love for one of the most persistent and effective women in our nation's history, Frances Perkins. I am deeply honored to be selected for this award and deeply honored to share this with Professor Heather Cox Richardson. I also want to thank everyone at the Frances Perkins Center for this award and for your tireless efforts to protect and preserve the legacy of Frances Perkins. I also want to give a special shout out to everyone leading the fight to protect the Frances Perkins Homestead National Historic Landmark in Newcastle. I want to let you in on a secret. Maybe it's not a secret. I love Frances Perkins. It's one of the reasons I was so honored to uplift her life and legacy in a speech before thousands of people during my presidential campaign. A moment that was made even more special when Tomlin Perkins Coggeshall donated barn board pieces to our campaign to build a wooden podium that traveled with me across the country. From the bottom of my heart, thank you, Tomlin. You know, since I was a little girl, the story of Frances Perkins has been a source of inspiration for many reasons. And sure, right at the top of that list is that Frances was a woman who broke barriers. She was the first woman in U.S. history to hold a cabinet position. Coming out of the Great Depression, she was the chief architect of the New Deal. We can thank Frances Perkins for the 40-hour work week, the minimum wage, unemployment insurance. She was also the head of the Committee on Economic Security, which created the blueprint for Social Security. Wow. Frances Perkins was a trailblazer. But there's more to her story than her accomplishments. The way I see it, the essence of her legacy rests in what she was fighting for: opportunity. Frances believed down to her bones that government should be a powerful force for good in the lives of people, and that it was the responsibility of government to give everyone a fighting chance to build a life that they could be proud of. Here's how she said it: the people are what matter to government, and a government should aim to give all the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life. That truth rested in the heart of every fight she fought, and I believe it should inform the ongoing fight for social justice that so many of us are engaged in today. And boy, do we have our work cut out for us. A global pandemic not yet under control, an economy struggling to bounce back, a racial reckoning that has only just begun, and the deadly consequences of climate change, all bearing down upon us. This moment of crisis has laid bare the deep injustice and inequities that persist throughout our society. As a nation, we can no longer turn a blind eye to the struggles of working families and the challenge of systemic racism. It is a good thing that we are finally paying attention. And here's why: you can't heal what you don't reveal. At this crucial moment in our history, it is up to us to build pathways of opportunities for working families to get ahead and stay ahead, and to tackle injustice head on. So today, I am honored to accept this award, but I do so with the commitment to fighting like hell for the America Frances Perkins dreamed of. An America where no matter who you are, where you come from, who you love, or how you worship, you are safe and your opportunities look pretty much like everyone else's. I believe that America is within our reach, and I'm honored to fight alongside you to make it a reality. Thank you.
Americans are known as storytellers. Ask us a question, and you'll often get a story as part of the answer. In our diverse country, this is a way for us to define who we are and to let people know where we've come from. But it's also a way for us personally to define our own past, who we've been, who we want to be. I'm Carl Nold, President Emeritus of Historic New England, past chairman of the American Alliance of Museums, and a trustee of the Frances Perkins Center. To understand the life and work of Frances Perkins, we come to the one place that she knew and treasured throughout her entire life. Here at the Frances Perkins Homestead, we can experience personally something of how Frances lived and how it shaped her character and the work that she did on behalf of the nation for the benefit of us all. A homestead visit allows us to explore her story, but also helps us to understand our country's past and our own. All of us have been touched at some time by the programs that Perkins designed or influenced as part of the New Deal of the 1930s and 1940s, including Social Security, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Fair Labor Standards Act, anti-child labor law, and a minimum wage. This place embodies Frances's anchor to her own family and her own history. It represents her roots. Frances spent summers here as a child, influenced strongly by her grandmother. The family farm and the brickyard they operated down by the river were places of understanding, work, and workers, who in this place were family members and neighbors. Here she saw American values of ingenuity and self-reliance at work, but also the challenges of an ever-changing economy, illness and injury, and how work done here in rural Maine was influenced by national and even international events. History is found in the landscape evidence that survives here at the homestead. The farmland and walled garden, brickyard site, the house and barn, foundations of structures that are gone, and even rocks that are named to reflect family experiences. 57 acres remains in ownership today, serving as open space that will be accessible to the public and will give us an opportunity to study the land through historical research and archaeology, to explore its original ownership by Native Americans, its history with the Perkins family since the 1750s, and what it means to the local and national communities, including you and me today. The most prominent part of the site is the brick house, built in 1837 for Perkins' grandparents. Visitors are surprised to find such modest scale of house and contents for such a notable person. While Frances lived in many different places during her life, this is the home that she knew longest and best. The buildings are the real thing, what we call the original fabric that Frances herself experienced and helped shape over time. She felt that this is where she belonged, in spaces she knew well, where she interacted with family and with neighbors in a very personal way. It was a place of retreat, of thought and reflection, indoors and out, supporting her busy life elsewhere by giving her time to relax, recharge, and think. Coming to this authentic place today, seeing it for ourselves, experiencing it as Frances did, gives us a framework for learning and telling the story of her life and legacy. For its association with the life and work of Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member in U.S. history and a powerful force behind so many programs and policies that continue to affect our lives today, the homestead is designated as a National Historic Landmark, the highest level of recognition given by the United States government to historic places. The land and buildings were purchased by the Frances Perkins Center in 2020. A restoration program has begun to ensure the long-term preservation of the land, buildings, objects, and documents found here. We are preparing the homestead for new uses as an educational site and to welcome the public. A highly competitive Save America's Treasures grant will provide about half of the funds needed for the preservation work, with grants and private contributions funding the rest, and supporting creation of an education center that will welcome the public to our mission of preserving Frances Perkins' memory and honoring her legacy. Preservation of the Frances Perkins homestead is a national initiative. This is a place of great importance to all of us. It's about our past, but it's also about our future. Please join us.
I want to thank our wonderful awardees for their very inspiring remarks. It was a terrific program. And we are very eager to reopen the homestead in the spring of '22 and begin to offer programs such as this to even wider audiences. We see lots of potential here at the homestead and the new education center that we will be building. It will be fully accessible and LEED certified, and will be able to accommodate visitors, student groups, scholars, students, and be able to inspire current and future generations. We're very proud of the work we've been able to accomplish through the Frances Perkins Center. We've grown each year and done very well. We have a bigger vision ahead of us, and we hope that you will help us by joining our capital campaign and helping us close the gap to our $5.5 million goal. For more information about this, you can find us at francesperkinscenter.org. And we look forward to welcoming you at the homestead. Please plan to visit us in the coming years.
Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you will continue to stay in touch and enjoy our programs over the coming year that will be announced on our website and through other media. Thank you to our honorees for their work and participation in today's program, and to our sponsors and supporters for their assistance in making this program possible. We share Frances Perkins's guiding principle. As she said, the people are what matter to government, and a government should aim to give all the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life. We applaud Juana Rodriguez-Vazquez, Heather Cox Richardson, and Senator Elizabeth Warren, who help us to share this message with you.